Hey there, everybody. Welcome back, or welcome if this is the first time you've joined us here on Practically Platonic. Today, we'll be discussing chapter 1.8 of the Enneads on what evils are and where they come from, and also the very, very brief finale to book 1 of the Enneads, which is on exiting the body. I have to say that this chapter has been like a roller coaster. I was extremely confused. And then I thought I was understanding what he was saying.
Mm-hmm.
And then I ended on pure puzzlement. So I think I understood some of the core ideas he had as far as what evil is, how that relates to the good or virtues, and how evil manifests in the form of vice in the actual material world. But I feel like I thought he was contradicting himself, or more likely, I was just not quite understanding his explanations and some of the terminology that's used, even though this book does give some definitions of some of the specialty terms he's using. So please let me know what you thought of this chapter.
Yeah, this is a really challenging chapter, and it builds on everything we've read so far. This idea of the eidos, the divine forms, and then the soul extending from that. And then there's the question of how does matter influence the soul, and how is it that vices come about? Plotinus takes a pretty strong position here, suggesting that matter is evil, and it is clearly the source of all evil. And then evil in this case is understood as that which leads to vice. And if I understand him correctly, he understands vice as things like cowardice, licentiousness, these sort of self-destructive or harmful behaviors. And I
Well,
suppose from
he also, I'm sorry to cut you off, but he also, I don't know if he would call these vices or just evil, but he also gives example of like sickness and ugliness, which can be seen, I think he means like physical ugliness, maybe deformations as being examples of that. And that to me kind of makes sense, where he says like a sickness will be maybe an excess of or a lack of something necessary in the body, even though he's speaking of it in very primitive terms by today's medical standards. It's still broad enough that I think it still rings true. Usually, a variety of sicknesses are due to some sort of lack or imbalance molecularly or cellularly, deficiencies in nutrients, et cetera, genetic problems. So I don't know if vice falls into, or that falls into the category of vice as well or not, but he definitely sees these as examples of evil in the world in a way that to me seems similar to vice, where it's like the manifestation of evil in the material world versus pure evil, which he also does stop and says like, evil is material, or is the origin of evil is material. The cause of evil, or I mean, the result of evil is vices and these other things. But he also gives a definition of like, okay, what is evil? Why is material evil, or why is it the origin of evil? And that is the part that was confusing, because he says one thing and then he tries to expand upon it, and it gets a little confusing to me.
Right. And he also starts off with early in the chapter where he talks about the life of the gods, carefree and blessed, and evil is nowhere there.
Right.
So
Well, they're
at
in the
the level of
intelligible.
at the level of the divine realm, there is no evil because there is no matter in the divine realm. I think there's also, to some extent, some sort of connection there also with the ideas of the celestial spheres, where, for example, at the level of the heavenly bodies, for example, everything is perfectly ordered and there's no chaos. So just from observation, you can see that the movements of the stars and the planets are all predictable and perfectly ordered. And I think you see that more in Iamblichus, if I remember correctly. But there's also this sort of sense that, like, at a higher level, things are ordered and not affected with the sort of chaos that we experience here at the material reality. But then as living beings with our souls enmeshed in matter, we have to kind of live in this chaotic existence. And the further we are away from the good, that is to say, the divine forms, the more we are subject to vice and all of the sort of chaos that comes with matter. But then building on also what you noted there, that things like sickness and so forth are also considered evils. And my take on that would be that having a deficiency in health is also a experience or a state that prevents us from living our optimal lives, and it also prevents the optimal expression of the forms. And so that's why it would be considered an evil.
Right.
It's not
And
a moral evil. It's
right. I think his definition of evil and good throughout this book is much, much wider, much
Mhm.
broader than the way these terms are used loosely in modern society or with more of a Judeo-Christian bent. I think that he thinks that equally evil is just a different kind of evil versus a moral evil, but it is at its origin caused by the same kind of thing, which is matter and what he defines being evil, if you want to get into that a little bit, because he says that it's non-being, but not in the sense that it doesn't exist, but that it's something different than being.
right. It's only a matter only exists as an expression of the forms, and even then it is deficient because it doesn't have any sort of substantiality or inherent quality to it. And he says, so evil consists not in any particular type of lack, but in absolute lack. And he also says, lack then amounts to not being good, and evil is absolute lack.
So maybe it's becoming a little clearer to me, and correct me if I'm wrong. I guess I was thinking about matter in a very, empirical way versus how he means it. So absolute lack being still just matter, but matter that is not imbued with any of the soul or the intelligible forms whatsoever. And since without it, it's more than ephemeral. It's basically nothing.
It's changeable. Yeah, it's
It's
inherently
changeable,
changeable.
but it has no inherent form, therefore no inherent identity, therefore no inherent beingness, to use a term grammatically incorrectly, but it has no inherent being, therefore without the intelligible forms, reflecting upon it, it is non-being in that sense.
Right. It doesn't have any sort of fixed identity or quality. So
Right.
the intelligible forms do have fixed qualities and order to them. And there is an ordering at the level of the intelligible realm, a perfect ordering that encompasses all of the intelligibles,
Yeah.
but
He
at the
says
level of
absolute
matter.
lack. He also says for something to be evil, there must be a causality, as the one is a causality of goodness. I think that's the part where, not that I thought he was fully contradicting himself, but it was kind of a little contradictory in the sense, because he earlier says that evil, unlike what I believe Plato thought it was the contrary of the good, and Plotinus disagrees with this. But then here he's kind of setting up a dynamic where he's like, oh, evil has to have a causality, which is, we'll discuss, just like the one has a causality, which is goodness. So he's kind of setting it up as if they were opposites, even though he just said they're not. He does go on to say that the opposite of evil is virtues, or the opposite of the expression of evil, vices, that its opposite is virtues.
And so evil and matter are an inevitable expression of the one, the forms, the soul. And so it's not so much that there's some sort of planning involved in this or some sort of intelligent design underlying this, but it's just a simple matter of necessity, that matter is the expression of the soul. And we have our
When the soul expresses itself in matter.
when the soul expresses itself in matter, and then we find ourselves as living beings enmeshed in matter, which leads to all manner of challenges, difficulties, suffering, and also a process in which we tend to probably even further enmesh ourselves in matter through licentiousness, excessive desires. And so this also becomes the sort of moral issue, I believe. And there's a sort of, therapeutic quality to thinking like this, where if you mistakenly believe that matter is good and worth pursuing, then effectively you're chasing after phantoms. You're chasing after what is effectively non-existent, not necessarily in an ontological sense, but like in an epistemological sense. So you can, for example, have great desires for example, sex, but you still have to contend with the fact that matter is quite changeable. You are also changeable. And just as an example, if you're pursuing these sort of desires, lustful desires in the long term as your primary purpose in life, you will inevitably get older, you will face sickness and so forth, and that leads to kind of psychological distress. And so we see this, it's a common story in humanity that, old age, to use, Buddhist terminology, old age, sickness, dying, and death affect people a great deal psychologically. So when you're not as young as you used to be, but you feel like you ought to be as young and energetic as you used to be in your pursuit of physical desires, that can lead to all sorts of cognitive dissonance and distress and so forth, and also lead to all sorts of harmful self-destructive behaviors, such as not acting your age or hurting other people in the process of the pursuit of your desires. And all of this is for the pursuit of something that's material. But the problem is that matter is very, in a sense, intangible, because it's always changeable, and you're also changeable as well. But then if you direct your mind toward the intelligible realm, then you're actually looking at that which is substantial, that which is existent, that which is true being, which is the forms. And so the more you orient yourself away from matter, then psychologically the healthier you'll be, because you're looking at that which is truly substantial and real. And I think that is a therapeutic component over the long term, because then you'll see reality not so much through the lens of how can I satisfy my material desires, but rather how can I live the best life that's the most virtuous and optimal. That's kind of and then this feeds into the final note of this book, is that you should not terminate your life prematurely, because there's always room, or hopefully there's always room, for further progress. Whereas to separate the soul from the material body prematurely is very not just detrimental to your well-being, but there's also a point here that you're also prematurely terminating your moral progress and also your pursuit of wisdom. That's sort of my take on it.
He also says something to the effect of that when someone ends their life prematurely, it is usually through some sort of violent mean, and in the moments or minutes or hours or whatever prior to doing this, the kind of mental state you have to be in is one of violence, despair. He uses some different, but he believes that the moment that you kill yourself, your soul is going to carry that kind of energy with it. He says as much in the chapter. And so if the last moments are where you are morally in a state of despair and violence, it is not going to be helpful once you're dead. And he gives a couple of examples of what he thinks may or may not happen after death. Killing yourself certainly does not help your progress then on. I thought that was interesting that he does have this connection, which kind of makes me think of like ghost stories. If you think about it, like the idea that a violent event has happened to someone, and in ghost folklore, then that kind of like Lemuria, or even like more modern stuff, that it kind of taints the soul of the person and it kind of stays with them. And he does talk about a Hades where they're kind of either wandering and unfulfilled, or I think he mentions maybe reincarnation, but it's not just, you can't further yourself morally now, but outside of time, it's probably not to your benefit either. But going back to this chapter that we're talking about, I think you gave a good summation of how evil presents itself through the vices, and how he is suggesting we try to live our lives or navigate this, especially morally. I do think, though, that I tend to maybe also emphasize a little bit more some of the, not just the ethics, but some of the cosmology to this. So at one point where he says, and I thought this was really interesting, he says that evils take a hold of us unwillingly, which is really, I thought, coincidental with a couple of weeks ago when I was reading this, this famous neuroscientist, and I've seen some of his lectures and stuff. I think he works, I don't remember if he's at Harvard, Robert Sapolsky. I'm somewhat acquainted with his beliefs on bioevolutionary genetics, but there was a bunch of articles in mainstream news. I guess he's coming out with a book, so but he is of the idea that we have no free will, that everything we do, or at least the way the articles posit, and I disagree with him, and a lot of other scientists also disagree with him for other reasons I'm not going to get into. But I thought there was I think he's not completely wrong, and I think it really overlaps well with what Plotinus says here, to his wisdom prior to having the scientific knowledge at the time. Because if evils take hold of us unwillingly, what are evils? As we just discussed, they're all material. They're not the will that you have through the soul and the intelligible forms, right? Because we've discussed in the past that we do have free will, but free will is those decisions we make with our higher self, with the upper soul. and the evils that take a hold of us unwillingly, not just the physical ones, like the evil of maybe getting cancer or contracting a disease, but even mental illnesses or being a shitty person, I guess, in a variety of ways. I don't think he's wrong, because if we look at some of the science of today, and I don't think Robert Sapolsky is totally wrong either. He's just a materialist atheist, and I think quite pessimistic. And I don't think, and since I believe that there is also the soul, the portion of us that is the soul, that can then, as you've described, help navigate us and reorient ourselves. But that on a molecular enzyme level, almost, or in his opinion, every decision we make, every decision is the result of a myriad of other chemical, molecular, affected by external environmental factors and genetic things. And I think that is what, by the science we have today, that is exactly what he's talking about here, that evils take hold of us unwillingly. I guess I thought that was important to point out, in that what may be truths, come out even in antiquity and are reconfirmed by different methodologies today. Like certain truths are reconfirmed via different methodologies throughout time, I guess. And I found that one to be particularly interesting, despite this being the fact. The only freedom one does have, as you've mentioned already and we've discussed, is the free will of the soul.
Right. And I think this idea is seen also in the Stoics very strongly, because the Stoics suggest that the only thing you have control over is your will. And human beings are endowed with a spark of the divine. It's a gift of Zeus at creation. We're the species that has a spark of reason. So we can either assent to reality or not assent to it and get dragged along. And so in the case of Plotinus, of course, he's not a Stoic, so he doesn't view things in that way. But I think for him, he sees it as a spectrum, so that if you are very much enmeshed in matter, then your free will probably, in most instances, will be severely diminished. Whereas the more you direct your mind back to the intelligibles, the more free will you'll have, because you'll be less dragged around by material concerns. And I think, to put that into modern terminology, we definitely have genetic propensities and a lot of even genetic memory as well that dictates our decision-making process. We also have our lived experience, our environmental factors, your body, hunger, and
I really do suggest to everybody listening to go look at this guy's research. And again, like I said, I don't 100% agree with him, and a lot of other people don't either in his field. He just takes it to like the next level, I think. But it then becomes like a philosophical matter, and it's kind of doing armchair psychology, looking at the history of this person's own life and the whole topic of how we have very little control on our decisions. It's like a lot more than you would think. There's like way more going on. That this is not a neurobiology podcast, and neither of us are equipped to even understand probably half of it. But
Right.
it's crazy. But it also makes me think of a discussion you and I have had in the past when it comes to astrology and the concept of free will or not free will. And correct me if I'm wrong, but I think you had said to me that as an approximation, you think that, a lot of things are, in broad strokes, a lot of things are already determined, but there is some wiggle room. And I'm guessing that wiggle room is the amalgamation of sentient beings' free will to some degree. I mean, I can't think of what else it could be.
Right. So there's a lot of things in our lived experience in our daily lives that we have no control over. Just as a simple example, the weather.
Right.
But then there's a lot of things too in our throughout our entire life that we're subject to. At a basic instinctual level, we're compelled by feelings of hunger and sexual desire, and also our mammalian instincts, particularly that drive us toward pair bonding or group bonding, in-group preference. There's all these sort of, environmental, genetic factors and so forth that go into our decision-making process. And so there's a lot that I think is predetermined. But then I think the more retracted you are from material reality, and the more you can observe your own mind, and the more oriented you are toward reason, then I think the more free will you have. And you also realize the limitations of that as well, because we're not omnipotent.
Right.
But
I would say reason with self-awareness, because I think a lot of people think they're super rational, but it's always kind of, external and not introspective. Introspective reason, I think, is the key here, right? It will then obviously, not that you're not externally rational as well, but I think the hardest part for humans is the ability to hone introspective reasoning and rationality.
Right. And I mean, it's been a long observation amongst philosophers and religious people that, for example, fear clouds the mind. I mean, you find this in Star Wars with the Jedi, the idea that
Find
fear
it in
clouds the
Dune.
mind. Find it in Dune.
Fear is the mind killer.
Fear is the mind killer. And it does very much affect your decision-making process. And I mean, obviously, from an evolutionary biological point of view, you can explain why that is. But in terms of like your basic lived experience today, it's very clear that when you are subject to fear, your sense of rationality can be interrupted, even completely suspended. Like some people get blackout angry, and it's almost like their animal instincts kick in, and they lose all sense of themselves and consequences to their actions, which is quite dreadful. But tying this in with what we're talking about here, I would say that there's a connection between, for example, fear and primarily matter, because when we're afraid of things, for example, we're afraid for our physical health and safety. We're afraid of losing our money,
Right.
which, nowadays, obviously money is an abstraction. It's a digital thing on the screen.
We're usually afraid of the unknown.
Or the unknown, but a lot of the, unknown consequences of the future tend to relate to matter, or somehow
Right,
related
absolutely.
to even sort of like at a slightly higher abstract level, like social status, because social status is not something material, but it's very much connected to material interests, because your social status determines your ability to acquire and retain wealth and so forth. Whereas if you, again, direct your mind more and more toward the intelligibles, then the less you're interested in these sort of material things and social status.
Right.
And so
And
forth.
these he would call vices, as he says that the vices and evil are not quite the same thing. Vices are the impediment that are the product of evil, but not evil itself, just as virtues are the product of the good, and can lead to the good, but are not the good itself. At least virtues as we can experience them or become virtuous, in this material realm.
Right. That goes back to the earlier idea of civil
Mhm.
virtues, where, for example, behaving yourself in a good way in your everyday life. That's, a product of the good, but it is not the good itself, but is orienting yourself towards this sort of higher good. So do you think that this sort of mindset has a sort of liberating or therapeutic process that would unfold from it? Do you think it's,
Understanding evil in these terms, I think it probably was very avant-garde for its time and very progressive, because unlike other forms of ideas of evil, and especially in the Christian Judaic system, no one is being blamed for I mean, obviously you have to take responsibility for yourself, but there isn't a concept of original sin. There isn't a concept that he's judging humanity or even individuals. It's just very matter of fact, and he's looking at evil and the source of evil, not from some sort of like divine moralistic place, really, even though it does have implications in social morals and suffering as we experience reality. But it is just another part of the nature of reality that has manifested, just as we could talk about other forces. I mean, it's different, right? It's metaphysical to some degree, but his way of dealing with it is much more similar to things like the laws of physics or something, versus the way that evil is seen in Christianity, if that makes any sense at all.
right? These are not moral commandments, and breaking them is somehow
Yeah, but
violating
the actual
God's command.
nature, right? But like he's describing the actual nature of evil in what for his era was like quite empirical and kind of rational, and it's something that exists not because of humans. It's just out there, and it will affect us, much like a disease can affect us, or it's just in his mind a force of the it's a force of the universe in a sense, because it only can exist in this material realm, and
Right.
it's like a metaphysical versus a physical force that has these detrimental effects.
Right.
But he's not, it's not used as this. It's not used to
Cast
criminalize,
right.
pass judgment. Yes, to pass judgment or criminalize or point to what the cause is somehow human. So yes, I think it's therapeutic in that, because it helps us move away from, it's not putting guilt on people, really. Not that it's saying that you should have no accountability, because those things are not the opposite, right? Even though that is often thought to be the case because of the kind of society we live in, which is very Christian oriented, even if for people who are atheists. But that's, but it's kind of like, okay, here's just like as if you were to go to the doctor or to a mental health specialist. It's not about like putting guilt on you. It's like, here is the issue. This is the environment that you're working in. This is the very likely effects of these factors, because factors of this environment are also the evils of material. For you to best navigate this, these are the kinds of things you need to do for your own good.
Right.
So I think it's very therapeutic. It's taking away guilt and just being productive. Like, how can we better our life? And also, it's not stopping at the state of like pessimism or like, oh, we're flawed. I mean, we are in a sense, but it's not morally. It's just the nature of how it is. It's like saying like I don't know if this is quite apples to apples, but it's like if you were to get cancer, that's horrible. And maybe there might be a genetic predisposition or something, but it's not like you're going to say, unless, I mean, I guess maybe some people believe this, but it's not, oh, I got cancer because I'm evil. No, it just shit happens. This is the nature of the world we live in. So you can fall prey to a lot of the aspects of vices. You got to take care of yourself, but it's not necessarily your fault in origin. And I think it helps move away from just a pessimistic worldview of like everything's wrong, everything's screwed up, everything's broken. We live in a fallen world.
Right. So this is so Plotinus is coming
even
from,
though he is anti-material, even though he is more about like moving away from the material, but it's not positioned in a moralistic place, and it doesn't push toward brooding about the negativity of the self and the world. It's just more about understanding and trying to productively make yourself as safe as you can, morally and physically, from the ills of material. That's how I see it.
Right. And so Plotinus is also writing from a non-Abrahamic, non-Christian point of view. So there's no sense of original sin.
Exactly.
And rather, he's saying that the individual, if they orient themselves properly, can in fact liberate themselves from the vice and all of the problems that follow with seeing matter as good or seeing
and if
matter as
anything,
desirable.
Unlike the idea of original sin, where the original sin is caused by humans, if material existed, and I think even through Plato's Timaeus, when he's describing kind of the evolution or the probable evolution of reality, evil would have existed even without us, because material would have existed even without us, because some form of material pre-existed humans, animal, like it's not, we're just in the mix. We're not the cause of it. We're, I guess, not victim to it, but we're affected by it. And if anything, and this is me speaking, not Plotinus, but the fact that we are embodied souls, we have the chance to be better than what the nature of the material universe is without embodied souls, right? Versus us being the cause of sin or evil, we can choose to elevate ourselves and actually be an expression of good in the material world.
Right. And so this sort of process of looking toward the intelligible realm or looking back to the soul is this idea of looking back to preceding stage. So when we go from basically being animals or creatures that are fully enmeshed in matter and completely obsessed with this material world, and we start to reflect in the reverse direction back to the soul, and from the soul back to the intelligibles, and from the intelligibles back to the one, we're basically fulfilling a sort of inevitable process in the chain of, I guess you could say, the chain of existence or the chain of being. And so it's not that, as you said, that in Plotinus's worldview, that this is some sort of fallen base world created by an evil deity. This isn't Gnosticism. But rather, this is just out of necessity that the material world and all of its problems exist. But then there's also this potentiality for us to turn away and look back to the higher reality, the sort of way forward out of it. But then this isn't like attempting to escape material reality, as in, like, for example, try to transcend it into some sort of transcendental universe. No, it's basically understanding how this whole process unfolds. And from that, I think the ultimate outcome will be that we won't have the sort of psychological distress that we normally otherwise would. And so that's one of the benefits of Plotinus's philosophy, I think. And you could also say that's the case with Stoicism or Buddhism, for example, where with the right mindset and the right mental orientation, and maybe even discipline to some extent, then you will suffer less. And so even if we take a step back and suggest that the materialist worldview, the atheist materialist worldview is correct, and that there is no such thing beyond, matter, and there is no past lives, there is no future lives, there is no divine intelligence. We're basically just, material biochemical creatures walking around. Even if that is true, I would argue that if we adopt this philosophical mindset mindset of the Neoplatonists or other schools that are comparable, then at least we live our lives with less psychological distress and suffering than we otherwise would
I
have.
agree. I agree. Even though, like, going back to Robert Sapolsky, since he said that he believed that it was absolutely impossible to make any decision, that everything is, we're basically walking automaton. This was brought up there in some of the articles I read. Other, people who don't agree with them, other philosophers, and also other neuroscientists that I guess at the level of their work, you can't not become philosophical. They disagreed. They said even if he were right, that is a very dangerous way to live your life. You cannot live your life as if you have no free will whatsoever, not even to the point of like what I'm going to have for breakfast, because he thinks like even that is not your choice, even though you think it is. Even if he's right, which many don't agree with, to live your life as if that is the case. You must live your life as if you do have a measure, or at least a measure of free will, because it is ethically and philosophically dangerous. And personally, I think contrary to what we've developed to be, because even if this guy is right, clearly we've evolved to not know that intuitively or think that intuitively. It's taken this guy's whole life to come to these conclusions and through research, trials in the lab. So we are meant to live as if we have free will. And I think we want to be the best versions of ourselves, or try to be, if we have enough control. If the divine in us is at least marginally stronger than the material that can cause deformation in us.
Well, if it is true that we have absolutely no free will whatsoever, no free will at all, and as you said, we don't even really decide what we have for breakfast, then it's just by random chance that a couple people on the planet today are aware of this reality.
Oh, I completely disagree for so many reasons. For example, if this were true, he also kind of semi-contradicts himself, at least in the excerpts from the book and the interview, because he says that external environmental factors as a stimulus on a biological sentient entity, or even non-sentient, will cause them to start acting differently. But even in the lab, it's been shown that you can create the exact same, like really the exact same situation or the exact same thing, and it is not always going to react the exact same way. And if what he says is true, there would have been, unless he says that like the progression of humanity is also beyond our free will. But I think that if we're 10,000 years ago, if neurochemically, biologically, molecularly, enzymes, bacterially, we were always going to react a certain way to things, why have we evolved? Why have we evolved technologically, morally, ethically, philosophically? Why have we taken different choices? Why do people who are genetically from one area and have always lived in that one area choose to do things a completely different way, and maybe go to a different part of the world and behave in a way that it should not be consistent with what this man is describing? I mean, I'm sure he could poke holes in my argument, but I know that there are people who could take what I'm trying to say and have much more detail and empirical facts and show that this is likely not true.
There's also one outcome of this proposal as well, that if we have absolutely no free will whatsoever, then there's a few people just by random chance in history, such as the people who are aware of this and proposing this, and they're kind of like the chosen people who are aware that we have no free will, but they're the lucky ones who get to ride this train.
Well, he doesn't think he has free will either.
Right, but at least he's aware of it. He's one of the lucky people who at least are aware of it.
Well, he became aware of it through a bunch of research, and he's sharing his information. He's writing a whole book on it. I mean, this is a guy who has also chosen. This is also a man who appears to have chosen to like taken himself, like live in his like high castle and live in like a tent. I don't know, like live in a tent away from humans. He seems like very unhappy to me, and just has not made any sort of peace with, do not be of society, but be in it. Or as Plotinus would tell us to be, orient ourselves to the material, but do not selfishly and cowardly choose to not be part of the human experience and make it better. I mean, not that I guess I'm being harsh on this man. He's doing what he thinks he's supposed to do, but it's clear to me that there's a lot of other things going on, and scientists are still humans, despite what society likes for us to see them as these like infallible prophets. They have become the infallible prophets of divinity, but the actual nature of research and scientific discourse and what's put out there and what is not put out there and what is funded and not funded, and people's own experiences goes into this too, because he's not some hyper intelligent AI from 1,000 years from now. He's like a dude he's like a guy who he's a Jew who stopped believing in God when he was in his teens. I don't know. If you look up the guy, I mean, he's brilliant. He's done a lot of super interesting work on bioevolution, other topics that he's taught and researched. I really like, but I think he's just wrong about it being absolute. But that's because I'm not an atheist materialist. But there's also atheist materialists who don't agree with him. They think there's a measure of chaos or of unknown. I mean, look at the nature of quantum mechanics. Like,
right. So
the fact that like you don't look at stuff and it's composed a certain way, but the moment that certain particles are observed, they recompose themselves in a manner that they can be observed. There is a measure of chaos and of improbability and chaos out there in which we can wiggle and choose whether or not to be evil or not. Speaking of evil, so one of the aspects, which I think this is the other part. Now we're kind of like off topic, but we're not, because it's still about evil, and it's still about is that, and it was just covered in these articles. I think one of them, the LA Times and the New York Times, but he's a big proponent for this movement that's like, I forget what it's called, but basically that criminals, any kind of crime, violent crime, that we should not be in a punishment-based penal system because they have, no control over any of it, and that they should instead try to rehabilitate them. I'm sorry, but how can you rehabilitate somebody if you cannot change people whatsoever? I guess their argument is that like because of stimuli input, but I disagree, because people can go through exactly the same sorts of situations and two people will have different results. So I find their solution to be contradictory to their premise.
Right, that's in direct contradiction to one of the basic tenets of the Western judicial systems, which is agency and culpability.
Well, they think they think people don't have agency or therefore culpability. But then, if people have no agency, how can they be rehabilitated? Do you see what I mean? Like, if you are incapable of changing anything, how can you be rehabilitated? And I think that modern, it's not really done correctly, but in general, the purpose, with a few exceptions, of modern Western penal system is, even though it's not done correctly, is supposed to be some level of rehabilitation. It is not, or at least getting them, away from the population. Which, if these individuals think that there is no agency, isn't that really the best option? Shouldn't they just be like, okay, let's not punish them, but just put them in a box and keep them over there because they have no agency? Why do they think rehabilitation is going to work?
But this also is very, disruptive, because then it's also the so-called agents of justice, such as the police and the judiciary and everything like that, also have no free will.
Oh, of course. I mean, the whole thing is just, in my opinion, it's very much of our time in a politics of non-accountability.
Right.
And again, like, it's the extreme to which they go with this. I do believe there are a lot of aspects of what they're talking about which are truly real, but the 110%, no, we are just like automaton. We are just zombies of our submolecular particles. I don't believe that.
It also does away with the principle of, even justice in its most basic sense, because
it does away with everything that is human, really.
Right. And it's also disturbing too if, someone was to attempt to enshrine these principles in the judiciary or some sort of political system and suggest that ultimately nobody has any agency whatsoever. So it also follows, well, then does the state and all of its members also have no agency? And what's the point to having a society if we're just all running on autopilot?
Exactly why the philosophers and the other people in his field who disagree with him, or the ones that even will say, perhaps you're correct. The philosophers were like, even if you're right, this is pointless. Like, this is not productive, because like, what are you suggesting we do then? Like, what is the point of, like, I guess as a scientist, he's like, well, I'm just putting the information out there, but he's not. He's writing a book for the public. But I think this goes in line with the same kind of mentality of like, oh, we're overpopulated, you should just die and not reproduce, and a bunch of other things that are really in vogue right now from the materialist, atheist, pessimists of the zeitgeist.
Right, right.
But Plotinus ends on a positive note about evil. May I read the final
Please.
paragraph and you can explain it to our listeners? Because of the power and nature of good, evil is not just evil, since it appeared of necessity. It is bound with certain beautiful chains, like prisoners bound with golden chains, hidden by these, so that being like this, it is not seen by the gods, and human beings do not always have to look at evil. But whenever they look, they are accompanied by images of beauty to recollect. So the connection between the necessity of material and the evil it brings, but also the interwoven beauty of the intelligible forms that are there.
Right,
Because we
because
could not even observe without it, right? We wouldn't even be sentient.
right. So we're not eternally stuck in this mire of material reality, but rather we can perceive, if we attempt to, the expressions of the divine forms, which are by extension a power of good and inevitably orient us back toward the good. So there is a sort of optimistic note here at the end that despite the fact that we live among something which is basically evil, there is still the element in it that can direct us back to the divine. And so ultimately, it's a matter of making the right choice of whether or not we want to orient ourselves one way or the other. And these are the golden chains, which I would interpret to be the fact that we have the intelligible forms expressed in material reality, although we're not necessarily usually aware of this. But the more we try to attempt to generate or raise our awareness of this reality, then the easier things will become, and the more beautiful things that we can perceive as well. And beauty, of course, being the intelligibles.
Right. Well, I think I'd like to end this episode by bringing up a quote by my favorite optimist material atheist, who I think this quote I don't think Plotinus would disagree with. Carl Sagan said, "We are a way for the universe to know itself. And if we were not in our material embodied forms, we wouldn't be able to do that."
Right. And I think that's a very, very proper quote to end this with. And if you don't have anything else, then we can say farewell for now, and we'll see everybody next time.
Yeah, and we'll be starting with the second book of the Enneads next time, everybody. So stay tuned. Have a
Take
great
care.
week. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.